Today, I want to talk to you about cybersecurity. Now, we hear a lot about data breaches, we hear a lot about impacts, a lot about vulnerabilities, these sorts of things. But I want to talk a bit differently about cybersecurity than you probably used to. I want to talk about how it's changing our world, impacting our society, the way we live, where things are going, what exactly is changing, and what this means for us. And so, one of the things you notice about cybersecurity is that the more and more you embed technology into everything, the less and less it becomes about technology, and the more cybersecurity is ruled by the other forces of the world. So let's start with two of the most obnoxious words in the English language, fake news. Fake news is a really, really interesting problem. How many of you were following the unfolding situation in Saudi Arabia geopolitically? Right. It's a very, very contentious situation right now. In the last 6 months, we've seen some enormous changes. If you look back to May of last year, something really interesting happened that sort of acted as a catalyst for this. And that was the country of Qatar posted some comments online that were attributed to their leader, praising Iran, praising Hamas, denouncing some of the regional players in the area. This was a very, very inflammatory statement by any measure. And so this statement made its way around the regional media, and it caused a huge uproar. If you look at the neighborhood, Qatar is a very small player. The neighboring states immediately banned the media of Qatar. Then they moved to blockade the actual country. And they cited the emir's comment as a reason for doing this. Now, what happened here is that the emir never actually made these comments. His website was hacked, and these comments were posted, attributed to his name. But by the time the Qatari government tried to get out ahead of this, it was too late. The information had spread out all across the internet, the judgments have already been formed, and geopolitical actions had been decided. A regional blockade was put in place based on fake news. The US government has said that it was hackers from the United Arab Emirates that did this. So think about that. Hackers from the UAE are said to have hacked the Qatari government website, inserted fake news, and on top of that, geopolitical decisions were made with huge consequences. Huge, huge consequences. That's the world we're living in today. The Qatari government tried to use their traditional media channels, their social media, statements on their website to refute this, but it was no use. The disinformation was moving at exponential speed, and they had linear institutions to combat it. We've seen this happen once before pretty prominently. This was about 9 months before the US election. This was Barack Obama pulling Vladimir Putin on the sidelines of the G7, saying, don't even think, or please cease your operations where you're hacking our country. Don't even think about taking this further. Now, we all saw what happened there and how that ended up. I don't want to talk necessarily about politics here today. I don't want to talk about, what happened in the election. What I think is fascinating to study are the tactics that were used, because we're seeing these tactics all across the world right now. And what's really interesting is how Russia is said to have gone about undertaking this operation. And there's some very, very important lessons for us to draw from this as well, too. So first of all, we spend so much time, so much money, so much energy thinking about the most fringe security threats. Yet what we miss is the broken ecosystem that's all around us. How was the DNC hacked? How was Hillary Clinton exposed? How did her secrets get revealed? What happened is that it was done through spear phishing. Espionage campaigns are nothing new. In fact, I would argue it's the job of governments to spy on other governments. For purposes of policy planning, the Russian government needs to know what the American candidates think about their region and the world at large. This is a very normal thing. Countries spy on countries. There's no scandal here. Now, what happened was very interesting in the case of Russia. What they did was they went from a traditional espionage campaign into an influence operation. And that is what's new here. It's not just collecting information, but trying to act upon that information to use that for a specific purpose. That was new. That was very interesting. And if you look at the way they extracted information and released it, that is very interesting too. They timed it for selective disclosure for maximum damage. Why is it that Debbie Wasserman Schultz's emails, who is the head of the Democratic National Committee, her emails came out right before their convention, and those emails showed evidence that perhaps there was some bias in favor of Hillary Clinton. And those emails came out right before the DNC event, so the party unity was fractured. Trump had his famous Access Hollywood tape, and we don't need to repeat those comments, but we all know what he said. 9 hours later, that's when WikiLeaks started posting John Podesta's email. That is not a coincidence. So they exploited our existing weakness in political fractures. And then if you look at this purely from a business perspective, from an entrepreneurial perspective, what Russia did was extremely successful. This was very cheap, low cost, and based on real-world conditions and real-world feedback, they scaled up their operations. This is how entrepreneurs work. They do the same thing. So from an entrepreneurial perspective, it was a massive success. You've never seen a return of investment like that on intelligence anywhere in the world in any type of campaign. And then what the Russians did is they flipped our idea of free press and democracy and free speech on its head, and they used our social media echo chambers against us. I blame Facebook for this. I wrote a piece for Forbes in 2014 about how Facebook can influence an election, making the point that whether they like this or not, whether they want this or not, Facebook is now where our political discourse happens. The company encourages this. So they have a responsibility to figure out how to do this properly, because the platform can be gamed by bad actors. And what happened? 2 years later, exactly that's what happened. It wasn't just me. There are many, many people warning about this. I think fake news, at least in its current form of what we say, because the definition of fake news keeps changing. It's very frustrating. Fake news is an engineering failure by Facebook. Facebook essentially looked 3 years ago and they saw that the majority of the traffic on the internet is news. They only owned a portion of it. They didn't own the whole thing. Now, Vivek and I write and we pay attention to where our traffic comes from. 5 years ago, if you looked, about 80% would come from Google, 10% from Facebook, and 10% from who knows where. Now, about 80% of your traffic is determined by Facebook, 10% by Google, and then 10% comes from everywhere else. That was a design decision Facebook intentionally made. Facebook decided that they wanted to be the media. They wanted the publishing industry, but they didn't want to do the work that goes on in editorial rooms. They didn't care to learn or pay attention why we have editors in the first place. And that's to make sure that not just the most popular content is what's put out there in the world, that there is some sort of filtering, some sort of criteria, some sort of fact-checking that goes on. If Facebook knew what would happen in the last year and a half, I think they obviously wouldn't have done that. I think this was unintentional. Perhaps it was an optimism bias. You have to assume the best here. Perhaps Facebook honestly made a mistake and they missed this. Or perhaps in the pursuit of profit, Facebook ignored all the warnings and created a dangerous ecosystem that could be easily gamed by anybody. And so the United States was in a very, very precarious situation here. How do you respond to it? The Obama administration ultimately placed a series of sanctions on Russian actors, and we can revisit that in a moment, whether or not that was successful. I remember right after Trump won, right after in the aftermath of the election, where we knew there was some sort of major influence campaign by the Russians. We had all sorts of information from our intelligence agencies, but we didn't really know what this all meant. So how do you define what's proportional? What does a cyber attack equal? If a country hacks another country's website, is that equal to invading their land? Is that equal to a physical incursion? It's a very, very difficult thing to do. And then the United States is in the position that whatever they decide will become global precedent. When North Korea hacks South Korea's responses will be limited by what the US decides to do right here. And then there is a risk of faulty intelligence and attribution. Our intelligence agencies in the US have made mistakes before. The Iraq War, they've gotten things wrong before. Donald Trump said, what if this is a 400-pound guy sitting on his mattress? What if it's China and not Russia? What if he's right? The way we deal with this is that we look at other sources of information. So how do we know the Russians hacked the DNC? It wasn't the digital forensics that revealed this. What happened is that the Dutch intelligence broke into the cameras in the area of the Kremlin where this was taking place. They physically watched the hackers break into the DNC through their own security cameras. And that's how they were able to confirm this. So it was alternate evidence. It wasn't necessarily the digital forensics that led to attribution here. And then there's a need for balancing public deterrence with private response. What should the US do? Should they blow up some stuff in Moscow? Should they quietly sanction some of Putin's oligarch friends? What is the appropriate thing to do here? Now, I don't envy the Obama administration for the position that they're in. I don't necessarily agree with all the decisions they made leading up to this event, but it is a very, very difficult situation to be in. I mentioned the Obama administration issued a series of sanctions. In my eyes, those were a failure. Those were not enough of a deterrent. And the proof of that is the fact that Russia is now meddling all across Europe in elections. Germany, Montenegro, France, they're all over the place. And they're trying to exert influence the same way they did in the American elections. Now, what's interesting is in France, Emmanuel Macron's team saw this coming. They knew the hackers would come, so they filled their databases with false information. When hackers did obtain that, they didn't know what was real, they didn't know what wasn't, and they ran the risk of discrediting themselves. A very, very interesting tactic. Now, it worked. It worked in the period of time where the election took place, was able to go relatively interference-free. Now that information is out there, it's been collected, it may rear its ugly head again in the future. We don't know. And what really, really worries me is that it's not just Russia that's doing this, it's everybody. This toolkit has now been open sourced. These ideas of image manipulation and information manipulation and making things seem like they're coming from somebody when they're not, and making audiences seem like they're bigger when they're not, is now being used all over the world. I wrote a piece for Forbes about a month ago about the election in Kenya. There was a major fake news epidemic. The country was dealing with fake news in a way it hadn't in any previous election. And it was fascinating the things that are happening there. In short, the election is still in dispute. It was decided and is not seen as legitimate, and there is much turmoil in the country resulting from it. But you had things like fake tabloids that would be sent across WhatsApp groups and internet chat rooms. I'm having trouble with this too. This is the real paper, and this was the doctored paper. That was an entirely fake CNN news report that was going around online. Someone made a whole fake 5-minute video segment, and that spread through groups as well too. There was major disinformation, and that had a major impact on the quality of democracy and the quality of elections. So fake news is a major threat. So I want your advice here, your help. What do you think countries can do to build immune systems for disinformation? What are some things that countries can do?
Even among what we'll call legitimate sources, there isn't necessarily consensus on fact. My newsfeed had articles after the Nunes memos were released, like 3 articles saying that it was like a boon for Trump, and a bunch of others that said that they proved that Trump's statements about the memo are useless and fruitless. And these are all like legitimate sources not agreeing on the actual facts of a story.
Absolutely. I think the technology industry thought they had the truth problem, essentially finding one universal answer to every question. I think what they missed is the viewpoint problem, the fact that there are 10 legitimate viewpoints to every opinion, and that somehow needs to be balanced and calculated, and that's extremely hard to do.
People click on opinions, they don't click on facts. They want the clickbaity titles that talk about how, this proves that Trump needs to get impeached tomorrow or whatever. They don't click on the memo itself. How do you solve that problem? Because it's not wrong, it's not necessarily wrong, but people want opinions. They don't actually want the hard facts for themselves, most people at least.
Right. If you notice, Facebook, they just changed their algorithm to prioritize comments from family and friends, and this made things worse, actually. In many parts of the world, this made things objectively worse. There was more fake news than before. What's interesting is Facebook has actually been experimenting this for a year and a half in several countries around the world. It was a disaster in many of those countries. What they did was it moved all the news to an Explore tab. And people just forgot that they thought that news was banned from Facebook. They didn't know about the tab. So you all of a sudden had entire media publication companies, newspapers, that went out of business because they're now reliant on Facebook for their ad revenue. And then Facebook decides to change their algorithm, so they go out of business. So it arguably weakened democracy and weakened institution in many of those countries. I have a piece coming out in the next week or two with Laura Rittenhouse, who you may meet at some point if she's in town. She's an amazing lady. She was part of Warren Buffett's investment crew. She's now an expert on corporate candor, essentially. She studies language in corporations. And we have an article coming out about how we think Facebook has this exactly backwards. They're focusing on the second half of what's shared. I would argue that's not the problem. I mean, it's problematic, but it's not the problem. The problem is the first half over how people share. Sharing on Facebook is broken. And that's because what we have is a rampant bullshit problem. We have an interface that requires you as part of your identity to express yourself in bullshit ways that are ineffective, that are low quality, and that lead to bad discourse. So I think Facebook needs to entirely rethink how sharing works. I think that's the problem with fake news and what's driving things. Essentially, what we have here is a situation that's similar to what companies deal with every day. You have the spillover effect. When Sony was hacked, one of their employees had 20,000 Deloitte employees' information on their laptop unencrypted. So Sony was hacked, Deloitte was hacked. There's a spillover effect. There's the difficulties of attribution. U.S. and Russia is a particular situation. What about Russia and France? What about Kenya? And who knows what parties were involved there? The point is that attribution is very, very difficult. You have to manage crisis without control. Like the DNC, you don't know what information is coming next, but you have to manage for that, and you have to deal with it in real time. And then you have the tension of reactions and secrecy. Do you do something loud and public, or do you do something quiet and damaging? And they're very, very hard things to figure out. But the problem is our ecosystem is becoming more and more damaged. If you look at, and this is from the 2017 Symantec Internet Security Threat Report, if you look at where the money is moving, of course it's all moving to mobile. Because hackers don't just chase vulnerability, they chase value. They go where the money is. As our technology gets better, and in some cases worse, email phishing is becoming more and more popular and prevalent and more targeted. It's a basic thing where you get a fake email and they're hoping that you're tired, you're lazy, you don't notice it, and you input some information which you shouldn't be giving them. That's becoming more and more popular, and that's becoming more and more targeted at the industrial level too. If you look at the stats for each industry, they're skyrocketing in very analog industries that you wouldn't expect. So spear phishing is becoming very, very popular as a method because it's a psychological trick more than anything else. You're having the amount of identities exposed in breaches skyrocket as well too, over 1 billion now. You're having IoT botnets, fridge, your toaster, all these devices that you bought that are insecure, that are not properly managed. They're now ganging up together to commit crimes, and that's a big problem. 64% of Americans will pay a ransomware prompt if they receive it, and we'll talk a bit more about ransomware. And then nation states are increasingly getting in on the hacking too. One of the meta problems we have is that the nature of breaches and attacks are growing more sophisticated. If you remember last year, there was a WannaCry attack. This was a very, very big deal. I was shocked at how big this was, and I was shocked at how fast it went away, and we all forgot about it and moved on with life. It was an amazing series of events to watch. So what happened is that one day, people woke up and 200,000 computers across 150 countries had this screen on them. And this is ransomware. Ransomware is a type of malware that will encrypt your data and charge you access to your own data. So you'll get a prompt saying, you have to send $300 of Bitcoin to this address and decrypt your data or they'll delete it for you. So this is what ransomware is. And we've known this is a problem. We've known this is going to be an issue. We've seen small and medium businesses destroyed by this for 2 years, but we never saw the global debut coming on such a large scale. So all of a sudden, one day, computers all across the world have this screen on them. In Japan, Saudi Arabia, China, Thailand, you had ATMs, street billboards, all sorts of different places showing the same message. What they all are computers running some version of Windows, and that's most of what the world operates on. So we saw a very, very disturbing attack happen. Now, for a series of days, this attack caused a lot of damage. And this attack was stopped because there was a malware researcher who noticed a line of code whereby if you register a domain name, it would act as a kill switch. And the US government has now attributed this attack to North Korea. So think about that. North Korea attacked over 150 countries at once, over 200,000 computers. And who stopped them? It wasn't the US military, it wasn't the EU, it wasn't the UN. This is the nature of the threat we deal with today. Now, it was thought that that ransomware attack used stolen NSA weapons, and they repurposed those weapons for an attack. So if we look at the damage from this attack, it's pretty astounding what's happened. There was over $4 billion in lost information, productivity, cost to repair computer systems. But more concerning than that was that in the UK, the NHS system, the National Health System, was unable to send ambulances to the right place. And people were actually hurt because of it. There was physical harm caused by this computer malfunction. It said that some people died as a result of not being able to receive care. There's an actual human cost to this. And really, it exposed the broken nature of our internet today and showed us how crime is global while enforcement is local. And this is a central problem in cybersecurity. And there's two other data breaches that kind of illustrate this nature of changing things. The first was the hack of the Office of Personnel Management. In the United States, if you want to do anything sensitive with the government, you need what's called a security clearance. And to get that, you fill out Special Form 86. It's a list of things that you can be blackmailed by, a list of your secrets, your debts, your sexual improprieties, that sort of thing. And it's considered one of the most closely held, guarded documents. And of course, it was stored on an unencrypted server for anyone to get. And the United States discovered that Chinese hackers had obtained it 18 months before. So you had one senator say this was more damaging to U.S. national security than September 11th. Think about that, an attack that was more damaging than 9/11. And no one noticed it for 18 months. 4 million security clearance holders and their biometric information. So it's believed that the Chinese government, or who else has access to this data, now has a list of every single U.S. foreign agent in our national security apparatus and a list of their secrets. Very, very damaging thing. And it'll take the U.S. decades to recover from this. And the other attack I want to mention is Ashley Madison. So please raise your hand if you're a member of Ashley Madison. None of you? Okay. For those of you that don't know, Ashley Madison is a social... Yeah, if anybody wants to, if you're not sure, just raise your hand just in case. Ashley Madison is a social network for cheaters. It's where spouses to go find other spouses to cheat with. There was a hacking group that had a moral issue with this, and essentially they threatened to take down the website unless the owners of the website took it down themselves. They didn't comply, and a list of 30 million people was then released on the internet. And this is really, really fascinating to me because this is a new whole type of cyber attack we've never seen before. Because this has to do with secrets. Now, if you lose your password, your credit card information, even your online identities, it's inconvenient, it's damaging perhaps. Perhaps there's some financial loss, but you're not really revealing a core secret that nobody knew about you to the rest of the world. But this was different. So all of a sudden, you had 30 million people exposed at once, and you heard stories from all over the place, really crazy things happening. So first of all, this was great for divorce lawyers, of course, huge boon for their industry. Second, you heard anecdotes of guys on Wall Street having their wives come in and slam their profile down on their desk saying, what the hell is it? So all the secrets came out at once. And then in the southern part of the United States, something interesting happened. And it's a bit more conservative than the rest of the country. Churches banded together, and they went through the list to look for members. And if they found them, they would kick them out of their community and excommunicate them. And there's now been 6 confirmed suicides as a result of this hack. 6. And who knows what that number really is. 30 million people exposed at once, 30 million people's deep, darkest secrets out there in the world. They're on Google for you to search forever. And the threat is growing. So how many of you threw out all your computers when the Meltdown and Spectre bugs were uncovered? How about you?
Got a patch.
Yeah, right. So what's amazing is this was a hardware vulnerability, but the kind of software fixes were incredible. What Google did at the operating system level to deal with this was essentially a new branch of computer science. It was really incredible. So we're seeing major, I mean, the alternative is that almost every computer in the world has to get recalled. And that sounds like a bit of a mess. And how that works with implanted devices, pacemakers and such, who knows? And then a few months before that, we had the theft of major NSA offensive weapons by a group called the Shadow Brokers. And this is a very, very concerning thing. We're going to be talking a little later about the situation where Apple had an encrypted device and the government was demanding access to it. Now, the central premise of that is that the government can keep their weapons secure. They can keep their tools secure. If that's not the case, then what does that even mean for us? And then we had another website. This one's an international one. They had 400 million accounts leaked, Adult Friend Finder. You could figure out what that site is for. And you're starting to see ransomware on internet-connected devices. Ashkan Soltani is a very interesting security researcher. He's one of the good guys. They call him the white hats. He said, if I wasn't a white hat, I would be making ransomware for your self-driving car. You'd probably pay that if that prompt came up. So here's the original sin, and this was a map of the internet from 1973. These were all the nodes on the internet. This is all that needed to be protected. The internet was not built with security in mind. It was not built with identity, payments, these sorts of things. Nobody ever imagined you'd be using Tinder on it, you'd be using Amazon, Uber, all these things. The internet was never designed for that. That is the original sin that we are still dealing with today. So in order to turn the corner on cybersecurity, we need to focus on building resiliency rather than avoiding volatility. In simpler English, that means that everyone and everything will be hacked. It's what happens after the fact that matters. Does it lead to a damaging disclosure of information, or is it encrypted data that nothing can really be done with? That is the future there. So when we advise companies, we say you need to get out of this mindset that you won't be hacked, that you'll avoid this problem, and instead get out in front of it. So here are the 3 constant challenges that we'll have to deal with in cybersecurity. The first is that the attack vectors increase exponentially with every connected device. Cyber weapons are becoming cheap, democratized, widely available for anyone that wants to use it for any purpose. And with each new case of technology comes a new security problem to address. When we introduce implanted devices, drones, these sorts of things, it creates a whole new field of security that needs to be studied and dealt with. So let's start with the Internet of Things. We're shoving computers into everything we possibly can. Pacemakers, fridges, toilets, TVs, and of course the obvious that they're all getting hacked. Everyone is showing vulnerabilities in every one of these things. Now for a toilet, that's sort of strange, and I don't know who'd spend their time on that, but they did. Take that to something like a pacemaker or an insulin pump or a baby monitor and use something very, very different. Please.
There was this device, very popular device for kids, which was essentially a pocket laptop by this company which started with VTech.
Yeah, VTech,
So
right.
there were so many of these VTech devices out there, and they had this small camera on them that was a VGA camera. They were also like part of they were also big. They also became botnets. They were like a subset of the Mirai botnet. All VTech devices, they had some vulnerability in certain lines of their code, and they were taken. And most VTech device users are like toddlers. So yeah, that was something which was pretty concerning at that point.
I completely agree. And we're going to talk about this a bit more, but I appreciate Germany's approach, which is just to ban those products outright. They should never hit the market. It's ridiculous that we're entrusting children to deal with cybersecurity and parents by extension.
to know about that because one white hat hacker actually repurposed that VTech device and used it as a universal garage door opener.
Wow.
So yeah, it's pretty easy to do because the microcontroller that the circuit board that they use is very similar. So it's essentially a set of switches that you have to repurpose. And once you do that, you can pretty much make a universal garage door opener.
Wow.
Yeah.
I live in a city and I have a garage door for the first time in a house, and I physically unplug it. I don't trust that thing. The problem right now is that no one really has full liability. Manufacturers pass it off to customers. Customers just assume it's there. Entrepreneurs don't even think about it. And so we have a situation right now where everyone's blaming each other and nothing's getting better. Now, one thing very, very interesting I saw happen was at Muddy Waters, which is a Wall Street hedge fund. They found a report that said St. Jude, which is a huge hospital system, had a vulnerability in their pacemakers, their implanted devices. And they used that information to short the stock of St. Jude. Now, this is interesting. One, a Wall Street firm actually did something useful for us, shocking. Two, you saw for the first time cybersecurity information being traded upon in a market sense. The company was being economically penalized for bad cybersecurity for the first time. And this was huge. St. Jude then was forced to address this, even though this vulnerability was known for years. So this is a very, very interesting approach here, that you can use economics to penalize companies for bad cybersecurity, that perhaps this stuff should be priced in. How many of you are familiar with the attack on Chrysler's Jeeps? Most of you. I'll go ahead and ignore this video, but you get to see what it looks like inside a car that's being hacked. Now, this happened about 2.5, 3 years ago, and it was a really big deal at the time because it was the first time that an internet things hack really connected with people. Now, your toilet being hacked, that's weird and scary, but that's not really a problem. But your car being hacked, that's an issue. That's what you rely on for your safety, for your family's safety, that sort of thing. Now, at the time, I thought, okay, this is it. We're going to start paying attention to the security of our devices. But in essence, everyone forgot about it. They passed some legislation to make car hacking research harder. Somehow that happened. And here we are today. But what's interesting is internationally, the reaction was very different. In Europe in particular, they saw this as a watershed moment. And they started to regulate the Internet of Things in a way that we've never really seen before, that we haven't really seen in the US. And Germany decided that any Internet-connected toy for a child is not worth the risk, just like you were mentioning with the VTech devices. They made that decision. They said, we're just going to pull the plug on these devices, that it's impossible and impractical to secure a microphone and a camera pointed at a child all the time, so perhaps it's a bad idea to put one there in the first place. Now, we're going to need to really think about how we handle this. I've been struggling with this issue as well, too. I remember about 2 years ago, I was working with a group of universities on creating a system whereby you could certify the security basics of an Internet of Things product. Do they meet a certain set of requirements? Benchmarking, which is a very, very common thing in many industries. But the problem was we moved at academic speed, and by the time they were ready to sit down and really take the idea seriously, the market had passed us by. Now, the thing is, everyone's had this idea, so the problem now is network effects, that there's many, many competing different standards, and choosing one and moving forward with that is becoming a very big problem. So I'm curious your ideas on how do we fix the Internet of Things right now? How do we fix the broken incentive structure that we have? Do we need new laws, new practices? What needs to change?
Monetize it. And then if you have like an FDA equivalent for this that like penalizes you with a fine, I think that's some ways to go about it.
Yes.
So I think you could probably move at this in sort of like a technical point of view. Essentially, I think one of the easiest ways to do it would be to like target our routers because everything's wireless now and our routers are the closest thing to us. And so basically if you could firewall like anything that you don't trust, right? So like on my browser, I even run like a JavaScript blocker. It gets annoying sometimes, but essentially it won't run any JavaScript unless I allow it to run from whatever domains. You could probably do the same thing with a router. And essentially, I mean, for a tech savvy person, it would be easier, but essentially you just like block out everything and then only allow the things that you want.
It's a great idea, and I don't think that gets enough attention. Our home security devices need to be radically upgraded. Absolutely. Great idea. Clearly, there's a lot of interesting ways, technical things. The problem I see is no one's moving. No one sees this as their problem so that they have to solve it. I see what's broken in the U.S. fundamentally, and there are interesting technical solutions. I think what's broken in the U.S. is the liability laws. So the problem is that no one's responsible for this stuff, so no one deals with it. I think if that were to change, even if we were to choose one party and make them responsible, all of a sudden we see major change in the industry overnight. So just like we need to update our privacy laws, I think liability laws are a major area that need to be updated as well too. And then all new government agencies like the FDA, I agree. We need all these things, new technical solutions, radical home improvement, absolutely. Moving on from there, we need to talk about corporate security and how that's changing and how that's also interacting with individual security. This was a slide from the NSA leaks. And so in the US a lot, we've talked about the theft by Chinese actors of government IP, of state IP, of companies in the US. But we've never really seen what that looked like until this slide leaked. And this essentially was the first visualization we've ever seen of industrial espionage by the Chinese government, as assumed, on the US. And the former NSA director said the Chinese have penetrated every major corporation of consequence in the US and taken information. And the point of this isn't to pick on China. The NSA leaks also showed that the US government was hacking hospitals and universities in China. Now, why were they doing that? They weren't doing that to learn about alternative medicine. They're doing that because they could. Every nation will hack every other nation given the opportunity. And the same goes for the Brazilians, the Indians, the Israelis, the Italians, the Germans, every other country with a major active cyber offensive program. Literally every country is developing one now. And there's some interesting approaches to dealing with this as well, too. The one I want to talk about right now is the bug bounty. And really, it's a mindset change. Microsoft was very, very aggressive with cybersecurity researchers in their time when they were dominant. Facebook decided they wanted to do it differently. So they set up a bug bounty program, and it's been enormously successful by any measure. They've had 17,000 submissions, 61 highly severe bugs, and these numbers are probably higher than you're seeing right here on the screen now. And essentially what this does, though, the important thing is that you get the best security talent from around the world. So you've had a 13-year-old in a village in India point out critical flaws in Facebook's infrastructure. And now, how would Facebook hire that guy? It'd be near impossible to get that person on their team. But by setting up these sorts of systems, they're allowing people to contribute ideas to them as well. Now, this doesn't work for every case. Apple finally decided to do this, but Apple's systems are so secure and locked down that the bugs are so valuable. So Apple's not paying hackers enough to buy that information back. There's ways to design this, but this is becoming common practice all across the industry now. My dad drives a Tesla. It makes me feel better knowing that hackers are actively trying to break into that Tesla every day than if no one even tried to see if it can be hacked. That sort of thing, that mentality. So Facebook knows they're going to be hacked. They know there are going to be vulnerabilities that will be uncovered. So they want to get out ahead of it and pay people for that information instead of having that harm them. It's a very big innovation in thinking in the way we organize bug bounty. And there are different companies now that are coming up around microscale, essentially giving people just the amount of information access to do the things they need to do. Oftentimes you find the biggest cyber breaches are because one account had way too much access and information to everything else. And the fact is that we know how to deal with your run-of-the-mill cyber attacks. Now, if we're talking about a state-level agency that's targeting you or your company, there's very little you can do to defend against that sort of thing. But you're talking about your run-of-the-mill attacks. There's things you can do that prevent 90% of attacks, but we still don't do them. And the fact is, even in the corporate sense, this is true. Most companies don't follow this set of common sense advice. They just, now I've said a lot of things, bad things about what hackers do, that sort of thing. I want to make the point that hackers are a good thing on the macro level. They are our immune system in technology. Security is a very reactive industry. We only break things we only fix things after we see them break. And hackers are important in the larger sense to keep things moving forward. They point out what's broken so it can be fixed. And that's why Facebook celebrates hacking culture. Their address is one hacker away. That's an obvious thing to all of you, but to many people, they don't realize the importance of this mindset. It's about being scrappy, thinking asymmetrically, and looking for vulnerabilities. So let's talk about the collection of user information. This is how the internet used to be. This is a very famous cartoon from 1993. It says, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. That's no longer true. Now they know the type of breed you are, where you live, what dog food you like, who your dog friends are, and they can identify you down to the second and show you a different ad than another dog. That's the internet of today. What's interesting to me is that nobody wanted this. Actually, if you look at polling, if you look at surveys, everyone clearly says that we don't want an internet like this. One survey says that 86% of internet users have tried to minimize their online activities. Yet privacy-destroying services have never been more popular. This is what drives people like me crazy. We call this a privacy paradox. The fact that people say they want one thing, then they do a completely different set of things. See, in dealing with online privacy, we're talking past each other. And the things we say we want, we don't actually, our actions and behaviors don't show that. So what's happening is that social media has fused online and offline identity. And the turning point in the US was really Facebook. It used to be that you use a fake name for everything, your real name occasionally. Facebook flipped that around. Behavioral tracking and profiles constantly grow. Every click you make online, every purchase you make builds your profile for a series of companies to use that, and they sell that to other companies to target information to you. Machine-to-machine communications, increasingly including personal data. User attitudes and actions are not aligned. And then the Internet of Things and sensors make it functionally impossible to opt out of data collection. Now, if you're in a smart city and there's sensors all around, how can you opt out of a system like that? There's no functional way to. And if you look at the cost of surveillance, something very interesting has happened too. A report here that looked at different types of surveillance over time and the cost. 20 years ago, if the government wanted to follow you around, they would send a car after you or follow your beeper. And that cost $275 or $100. Now they track your cell phone, your GPS, it costs $5 to $10. What that is a 98% decrease in the cost of surveillance. We talk about in our lectures, when something becomes cheaper, more widely available, it becomes more accessible, more people use it for different purposes. And so the new realities of data collection and analysis are that most data about us will be collected from machine to machine. It'll be my toaster talking to my fridge, talking to a larger corporation of some kind. The definition of personal data is under threat. We need to think about what that means because it's a contextual thing. Data collected for specific uses is more valuable when put together. So it's not just one set of data that's interesting. It's a cumulative effect of all that data and what that reveals about you and your behaviors. Users themselves are creating enormous amounts of data and they're more engaged. And then we have higher policy demands for protecting innovation while balancing the downside. So you mentioned something like legislating encryption standards, which is, I think, a reasonable idea. Some might argue that that is too specific, that it limits technology to a certain period of time. And these sorts of demands are given, these sorts of arguments are given a lot more credence than they used to. Now there's interesting projects going on. This is MIT's Project Enigma. And I've heard that CMU is working on something similar from our prior students. What this is it's a blockchain-based system whereby you could upload your information and then sell access to companies to scan it. So let's say that I want to upload my genome to this platform here. I could upload my genomic data. Now today, if I did that traditionally, I'd go to a website, I'd upload it, and I'd agree to their terms of service without reading it, and then they do whatever they want with it. In this sort of setup, I could upload my genomic data to this blockchain, and then essentially I would charge companies for access to that, for their algorithms to access my information. So a pharmaceutical company could scan my information, their algorithm could, and if there's a match, it'll let us know, and we could take that further through a different set of means, but they never get access to my underlying information. They don't get to own it. They don't get to control it. I do. So it's a whole different way to go about rethinking user controls. And this has honestly been a dream of the identity community for many, many years now, this idea of a personal data store. And what that is that right now, every move you make online is owned by Facebook, Google, or a series of other companies. But if you were designing the system from scratch, you'd probably flip it around. You'd probably make it so that data was all owned by you, but you would let people access it. So you'd be able to revoke permissions. You'd be able to see who knows what about you. You'd be able to see what they know, that sort of thing. The problem is that there's no real reason to have this in the US. Our companies are established. Google has no interest in letting you have this sort of system. In fact, I think that's the biggest tragedy of Google Plus, to bring that up. The fact is they made an iterative, terrible social network when they could have done an identity moonshot and given us a dashboard for how to interact with our identity information and do all sorts of new things with it. It was a failure of imagination, and it's still a need they need to fill. I don't know many other companies that could step in and do this. If you were to build a system from scratch, I mentioned, you would include a system like this. I worry that this idea is quickly becoming outdated, because if you look at a self-driving car, it creates 750 gigabytes of data a minute. Part of that is personal information. How can a system like this keep up with data like that? That's what I'm worried about. So I think we need all sorts of new innovation in this idea itself. I think this idea is becoming stale, even though it's important. And then we need to deal with a huge amount of information that's out there already. Before the Equifax breach, we had another 200 million person breach in the United States. There was a small political targeting firm that went out of business, and they left their database online and they forgot about it. And the database existed and nobody owned it, nobody was in charge of it. It was an abandoned database. And you're seeing this more and more often. I think this is going to be a very large industry of the future. How do you delete data? How do you wind down information? There was one security researcher that compared this to low-grade nuclear waste, the fact that data outlives the span of a company, that some of the largest and most sensitive databases are being abandoned and left online. So the half-life of a company is at best 5 years, even that. But this data lives on forever. So getting to this question of who should own your data and what rights should you have to it. Is what we have in the US fine? I mean, you mentioned earlier the argument of convenience as an exchange for privacy. Well, I would argue that Facebook is pretty convenient, Google's pretty convenient, and I trade away my privacy for that. At what point does that no longer become a good exchange for me? What controls should you have? So if we were designing the US ecosystem from scratch, let's use the US as an example, who would own your data and what rights would they have to it?
The idea is BitClave. So BitClave essentially does exactly that. They say if you're searching for something on the internet and a user profile of you is being created on those searches, you don't want ad companies to benefit from your searches and profit for themselves. You want the advertisers to come to you and say, okay, we want to use this data to serve you some personalized suggestions or something, or maybe serve you suggestions from a marketplace. So we'll pay you for that. So that is exactly what they're trying to do. They're saying, okay, there are several levels of privacy that you can define for your data. If you say, okay, I'm going to share my data to these selected providers, then they will sell you ads and you will get paid for it. So that's continuing from what he said, that okay, you get paid for what you have, but then in exchange you might give away some of your privacy to those companies just because you may have a little bit of trust in them.
It's a great idea, but as far as I've seen, it's only that, right? It's just an idea. If that was ever in practice, that'd be a fantastic thing. And I wish them all sorts of luck, but I've yet to see a system like that scale, unfortunately. Now, one of the biggest problems right now is that our whole internet ecosystem is run by ads. It's what pays for the internet, it's what pays for news, everything like that. Now, a weird offshoot of this whole cryptocurrency world is there's a new business model that might work, which is hijacking a little bit of processing power from your computer when you're on a page, using that to mine cryptocurrencies. And that's weirdly proven to be an effective business model. It's a hack essentially, but it's giving this kind of hint of what this micropayment business model might look like in the future. One of the biggest issues that we're going to have to deal with is the balance between technology and government. We're now living in a time where you can't do anything without creating a record of some kind. We have over 250 million surveillance cameras in the US. Biometrics have advanced to the point where emotions can now be deducted from photos and videos. You have no ability to drive in the US right now without having your license plate tracked. Now, in most states, this is done at the government level. In many states, there is one company that collects all this information. What happened is that company has 5 years of data, and the Trump administration just signed a deal with them to use that information to deport illegal immigrants. Now, what happened is that company has 5 years of data, and the Trump administration just signed a deal with them to use that information to deport illegal immigrants. So 5 years of information collected, no one knew what it would be used for. Then the political winds changed, and now all of a sudden, that information is now going to be used to deport illegal immigrants. So a whole new category of enforcement and infraction added onto data that existed in the past. That scares the hell out of me. This is something I've been warning about for many years. And honestly, the technological barriers are gone, and all we have is the legal and ethical ones. And I thought this was a line we wouldn't cross as a government, but here we are. And we have biometric borders, giving your biometrics in order to enter countries and that sort of thing. And the next phase of that is everything is going to be understood. Computer vision has advanced where it can tell objects apart, see multiple objects, understand what they're feeling. And then we have the logical conclusion of that, which is things like pre-crime. And this is not just in Minority Report. The early version of this essentially is looking at where crimes are likely to occur and deploying resources towards those areas. It's just statistics. It's a quite logical thing to do. In fact, it's maybe a good thing to do. See where there are the most active robberies and deploy police there. The problem is that this is being taken down to the individual and the household level in the US. In Chicago, there's big problems with gang violence. So the police they have databases of individuals and they score them based on their likelihood to commit a crime. So we have reports of cops approaching individuals saying, hey, John, I know you're thinking about committing a burglary tomorrow. Don't even think about it. We have our eye on you. This is already being taken down to the individual level. There's another company that provides a score for literally every house in the US. And that score is 1 to 5, how sensitive you will be if a cop shows up at your house. So if you're marked a 5, then you may have a SWAT team come to your house for a small disturbance. Whereas if you're a 1, the cop may not draw his gun if he's not afraid or that sort of thing. So it's actually being used to make law enforcement decisions. There's a big question right now over what data our governments should have access to on our devices. Should we have this situation where our devices are totally encrypted and information on them can't be accessed? Or should the government enforce some sort of hardware backdoor which leaves all our devices a little less secure, but can allow government to access information in terrorism and crime and that sort of thing. Yes.
No, I don't want them to have all the access. Maybe like the general information that's important for them and not have access to like the private data, like anything that crosses that line they should probably not have access, or either ask me before they get access, or if there's a great way that I can limit that what all they can access it, I think that would be great. But at the top of my head, I don't want them having access. Not that you have anything incriminating, it's just that it's your personal data, and the more information you throw out there, the more you're vulnerable to, I don't know.
Right. So I think we're essentially going to have to reach a point where we either allow government some sort of magical hardware backdoor access to our encryption, whereby we're all left more insecure and we're open to all governments and all organized crime, or we have a situation where devices are so secure governments can't access them. And then you have a whole host of smaller crimes, perhaps murders, perhaps missing people, areas where you really would want cops to access that information, and they go dark now. And I don't see either of these as a really great possibility, but I don't also see a choice in the middle. So it's just something we'll have to think about and we'll have to deal with, and it's only going to get worse. It's moved into voice computing devices now too. There are Amazon Alexas where the wake word was triggered, and that little clip has some information that may be valuable to a crime, but Amazon is claiming it's protected by your First Amendment, right? This issue is going to keep rearing its head, and it's going nowhere. And in China, they've decided it's the opposite way. They have pure censorship. The Chinese government can censor images in a WeChat conversation in real time. So again, there's different spectrums to this thing. Whether that's something desirable or we want, I don't believe so. Let's talk more about limiting damage of failures in network security. So we're in the golden age of signals intelligence. Our devices know everything about us. And increasingly, we're believing screens and everything they say without thinking twice. This has an interesting link to national security again. There's a study that says that if you put a USB drive in a parking lot, there's a 1 in 3 chance somebody will plug it in to see what's on it. It's a pretty common thing. It might be me in some cases. I'm a curious person. You could see that going wrong. The U.S. attack on the Iranian nuclear program through the Stuxnet virus, this was more or less how this occurred. A USB drive was given, a scientist plugged it in, said that there was nothing on it, and for months that software gathered information. And then one day it sped up some centrifuges, slowed down others, essentially caused a meltdown of the program. This was thought to have set the Iranian nuclear program back by 3 years. This was during the Obama administration. But the problem is that this precedent has now set, and the idea that one nation can target another nation's critical infrastructure is now set as legal precedent. And we're going to have to deal with increasingly aggressive attacks too. If we look at the future of artificial intelligence in the field of cybersecurity, it's really an offensive and defensive arms race. So we need to work on improving our ecosystem at large. Now, one thing I mentioned, which gets a lot of blank stares from people in the cybersecurity community, is that we perhaps need to look at cybersecurity as an income inequality issue. The fact that poorer parts of the population, poorer parts of the world are using older Android devices, which no longer are patched, no longer are secured. And if you look at situations like, we have a big problem in the US of teenage girls getting their webcams hacked and that information being used to extort them. It's almost all on older devices. It's almost all targeting poorer communities. And this is a huge issue because our whole ecosystem is left vulnerable. If we're on a wireless network and half the devices are a botnet of some kind and sending spam in the background, it's a problem for all of us. So we need to think more comprehensively about the ecosystem. And we perhaps need to look at other industries and other fields, maybe even government, dare I say, for some advice on how to structure future institutions. We can look into the Center for Disease Control, which is an NGO in the US. They communicate information between public and private industry about the spread of disease. They track disease. Now, something similar to this for tracking viruses and malware on a global level could be very useful. We're putting increasingly powerful technology in everybody's hands. Now, when I give this lecture in 2015, 2016, I would talk about the fact that one day there'll be a beautifully working end-to-end encrypted messenger where you just download it and you type and it works. But it was always sort of a dream. And then in mid-2015, WhatsApp adopted the Signal protocol and Signal released their own app. And all of a sudden, WhatsApp rolled out end-to-end encryption to 1 billion users overnight. I never saw something like that coming. And it was actually quite a risky decision on their part. You had executives in Brazil from Facebook jailed for this, and other countries as well too. They went to jail over this decision. But New Year's Eve, a month and a half ago, essentially, there were 75 billion messages sent on WhatsApp. 75 billion end-to-end encrypted messages were sent. That's a record. It's amazing to see how fast this field has moved. So now I would point to this as one of the few success stories in cybersecurity. We should learn what they got right about user design, about scaling, about putting this in everybody's hands. Because the fact is, People are using secure messaging without even realizing it. It's a beautiful thing. And then blockchain can be used in certain contexts somewhat effectively. I'm a blockchain skeptic. I get dirty looks from people in San Francisco for saying that, but I think the vast majority of use cases I've heard are not useful. It's not needed for most of the things people say they need it for. And in the security sense, the only advantage I see really is immutability. The fact that you could have a record that can't be changed, that can't be accessed. So in certain small cases where that's useful, blockchain can be effective. And in about 2 weeks, we're going to be talking a lot more about blockchain in the financial context. So this is just to give you some perspective here. These are the types of services you can buy online. I used to have these, I took out these slides, but I put them back in just to give you an idea of the democratization of tools. These numbers, again, are a bit outdated, but just to let you know how cheap it is to buy these sorts of services. You're talking tens, hundreds of dollars for very, very sophisticated things. And then there are darknet, black market, places that exist outside of the searchable internet where there's marketplaces for drugs and guns and these sorts of things. The most famous of which was Silk Road. Raise your hand if you use Silk Road. Silk Road is a place you can go online, buy any drug you want, you pay in Bitcoin, and it's delivered to you. It's a peer-to-peer drug marketplace. And I had friends that used this, and they said it worked beautifully, and they said it was better, safer, more effective than any alternative they'd used. And I live in San Francisco. A mile away from me, a guy named Ross Ulbricht would go to the Glen Park Library. For those of you who know Glen Park, that area, he'd go to the public library there, and that's where he ran the Silk Road. This multi-billion-dollar drug enterprise was ran out of a public library. Now, I've been to that library. And essentially what he did was he made some basic mistakes. He logged into Gmail the wrong way. He opened a browser tab in the way he shouldn't have. And that's what essentially led to him getting caught. But he's not the story here. The story here is the fact that these will exist no matter what we do, no matter our best intentions. And this is where corporate information is sold. You can hire a hitman, buy child pornography, all sorts of horrible things are available in this. But the fact is that this is going to be a fact of life. We can't put the genie back in the bottle. And then we're going to be talking more about smart contracts in a financial sense too, but this is essentially a contractual agreement between two machines to do something when triggers are met. Now, I find this to be a terrifying technology and think that we have all the use case words and that this is going to be used more for dystopian purposes than utopian, but again, we'll talk more about this in 2 weeks. Curious to ask you, in a moment I'm going to talk more about prosthetics, and that's an area of cybersecurity where I mentioned I'm working on a book about advances in the field, and I find myself uncomfortably having the first conversation about security with a lot of these people, where I say, you know, have you thought about securing your devices, or what steps have you taken? And they give me a blank stare. That's never a great way to start that conversation. So I found that prosthetics and really any computer body technology is a huge blind spot and a major area of cybersecurity that we need to be focusing on that we're not. What else have you found? What areas of cybersecurity should we be paying more attention to?
I think everyone identifies the need to secure information that is generally perceived as sensitive information. But I think one thing that is interesting is that information that seems really innocuous in aggregate can actually be very powerful. And so I think something that we're not paying as close attention to that we should pay closer attention to is seemingly innocuous information.
I meant to put the Strava images in here. Any of you use Strava, the fitness app, for running, keeping track of? Anyway, if you use it, you might notice that you opt in to share your data. A lot of people didn't notice that. A lot of soldiers in 4 different militaries didn't notice that. And all of a sudden, Strava put their heat maps online of where their users like to run. A friend of mine is really, really fit, and he uses this app for everything. He's always telling me about it. This has been around for many years. No one looked in this data. But essentially, these heat maps would reveal military patrol locations and revealed it for the Turkish, the Chinese, the Russian, and the US military all over the world. Really, really sensitive information that's really hard to figure out all of a sudden became available and clear. Because when you look in the middle of Yemen and there's nothing there, but you have a regular patrol route, you could pretty much figure out what's going on. So this was last week. I should have put that in the earlier slides, but this is a huge national security issue, and nobody really thought that a running app could expose 4 different militaries' patrol routes. Here we are today. And then we have to prepare for the next generation of cyber threats as well, too. I mentioned there's going to be a race between offensive and defensive AI that will constantly be changing. It'll be an arms race between companies, governments. And we're going to do things like automate behavior modeling, anomaly detection, basically use computers to study patterns and figure out what's irregular, and use that to help us make better security decisions. And then there's quantum security as well, too. And we're awaiting the quantum moment, the point at which quantum computers show that they're viable and that they pose a threat and opportunity to our world. Vivek mentioned the 5 S-curves in computing. This might be the 6th paradigm of computing. Instead of using ones and zeros to calculate things, we use the rules of quantum mechanics. And we're essentially beaming information through light. I'm sure you could get a much better explanation of this elsewhere. We're not going to spend too long going into that. What I'm more interested in talking about is the applications of quantum computing, specifically how they're going to impact security. So building an analog quantum computer, we're almost there right now. If IBM says by the end of the year they'll have a working 50-qubit computer. And then we simulate complex interactions, all sorts of applications of quantum chemistry, material sciences, all sorts of different things. But as we get to more advanced quantum computers, that's when things start to get really scary from the security sense. At 300 qubits, computer can do more calculation than there are atoms in the universe. So all of a sudden you have a computer that's very, very difficult to fool, and it creates issues with factoring. Essentially, the factoring we use for RSA all becomes discernible by a computer in a reasonable amount of time. To take the case study of finance, what will quantum mechanics and computing and encryption do in finance? First of all, you'll be able to have a constantly balancing perfect portfolio because your portfolio will be able to, in theory, test every combination at once and then figure out the best mix for you and to be able to constantly do that. It can run algorithms that were previously non-executable before. They can use less data and less power to figure out more advanced things. There'll be highly effective pattern recognition and fraud detection. There'll be new types of high-speed trading. And then, of course, there'll be the need to update clients' data. And quantum computing is going to lead us into new infrastructure. Countries are now going to be able to build closed networks whereby they can use quantum encryption to send information back and forth. China is a world leader in this right now, and they're by far ahead of everyone else. And they've shown the ability to have a closed network where it's effectively unhackable with today's technologies. You never use the word unhackable because everything is hackable in time. So for the moment, this is virtually unhackable type system. And it will allow hackers to decrypt the last 50 years of information. Now, the NSA is preparing for this. All of our security agencies are preparing for this, but they don't know when this moment will come. And that's really dangerous. And then we have the next frontiers of essentially moving computers into the body. On the left is a Luke arm, on the right is an exoskeleton. These are wearable robotics. They're wearing robots. And one of our brilliant students at CMU last week made a great observation. She said that robotics gets to problems of every other field of technology. So every problem with sensors, with data collection, analysis, privacy, hardware components, etc., robotics gets all of those problems together. So in robotics, you have to deal with all of the issues that you have to deal with in any technology. And that's going to become increasingly important as we put robots into the body. I mentioned exoskeletons, wearable robotics. People are going to be using this in all sorts of industrial settings, probably far more so than the paralyzed using this to walk again. That's the use case you hear about most often. But really, you're talking about a small market. Really, less than 50,000 people could use this sort of device for paralysis and that sort of thing. But if you're talking about construction workers, delivery people, that sort of thing, soldiers, that's a much, much bigger market. So you're going to see exoskeletons in industrial contexts all over the place. Now, another thing that brilliant student mentioned was that robots are capable of exerting enormous amounts of force. Essentially, if you program a robot incorrectly and it grabs someone the wrong way, it can break their arm. It can do a lot of physical damage to them. And oftentimes, for example, I was doing some research into mechanical lifts. Now, they're machines that help people stand up when people aren't able to stand up on their own. Now, you need a really light push. It's not about shoving someone into place. It's about giving them a really light assisted push to prop them up. That's what the technology is. You don't need a lot of force. But if that is calculated incorrectly, that could really hurt somebody. That could really do a lot of damage. So we're going to have to think about how do we secure robotics. And then there's brain-computer interfaces. And this is a technology that we're rushing ahead with very little understanding of the underlying science and how it works. And this is a whole new frontier in cybersecurity as well, too. Neuralink, Elon Musk's company, there's several other companies that are working on commercializing this right now. But if you look at the cybersecurity threats of brain-computer interfaces, there are things like planting false memories or being able to discern information that people didn't want to consensually give. This is a whole new field of cybersecurity that needs to be dealt with. This is my puppy, Samosa. This is a painting by John Singer Sargent. And this is Deep Forger that essentially took the characteristics of the painting, applied it to my puppy to make this beautiful painting. Same thing with Picasso. That's Samosa. And that's Samosa as a Picasso painting. But you can also do this to videos as well. So I showed you how you can manipulate images. Videos, this is software you can download on GitHub right now that can take a horse, make it look like a zebra, and the human eye can't tell the difference. Now, what about when this is applied to people?
She's the purpose of which is not to try to defend the policy, the purpose of which is try to show people what it's like to be the president.
The point is that you could take an off-the-shelf parts, make fake statements from a person. Now, this was about 6 months ago, and the technology, of course, has expanded very rapidly since then. Isn't working. This is Donald Trump as Michael Scott in The Office.
David, here it is. My philosophy is basically this. Don't ever, for any reason, do anything to anyone, for any reason, ever, no matter what, no matter where or who you are with, or where you are going, or where you've been, ever.
This was done in 10 hours. That's all it took. A computer 10 hours to make this sort of thing, to make Donald Trump mapped onto the face of Michael Scott with all the expressions and able to say his lines. So that's where we are with technology now today. And there's a whole weird subculture on the internet, obsession about Nicolas Cage. I don't really get it. I sort of miss that, but people love Nick Cage or they don't like Nick Cage. I don't really know what's going on. But the point is that there's really fascinating papers about applying Nick Cage's face to deep learning. And someone made a series of video clips whereby Nick Cage is everybody. So it's like he's Lawrence of Arabia, he's Indiana Jones, he's Jennifer Aniston in a bathtub. And some of these images, like him as Michelle Obama, you can't forget that once you see it. It's very, very jarring and strange. But essentially, this is computers doing simple things. And look at how, well, I wouldn't say these images are good, but look at how decent these images are for computers. Now, there's a bigger problem, which is that now our faces can be used to say things that we didn't mean to say. And we can have quotes attributed to us that we never said. So I mentioned the Emir of Qatar. We're talking about text posted on a website. What about when there's a video of him posted online saying something he never said? And that's the threat we have today. And of course, where does all technology start? Porn. So people, of course, took this to porn. And so there's a whole subreddit on Reddit called Deepfake. Essentially, if you go there, the whole community of people that are applying other people's faces to pornography. Now, I did a lot of Google searching on fake AI porn for you, so I'm sure my ads are going to be crazy tonight. These are the sacrifices I made for you. This is Gal Gadot, Superwoman, and she was mapped onto an existing porn. But that's not her. Look at how realistic that looks. Her body movements, the way she's walking around, everything. That's an entirely fake image you're seeing there. Now, if you saw this video, you would think that's just her. You wouldn't even think it's somebody else. What we have here is we have a problem of global crime and local enforcement. So we're going to need to build some new institutions, new global institutions. Now, global institutions are not very popular right now. And that's a shame because we're going to need new ones to be able to handle these things. So we've heard really interesting things proposed, new FDAs, new technical standards. I want us to think big for a second. Think about the world and the issues that it has with cybersecurity. What are the new institutions that we will need to build to deal with a growing security threat? What do you think we need that we don't have right now?
Services that companies hire to sometimes manage some of this for them. I know, like at work, they made the whole company, every employee changed passwords in 2 days. Like it was done. So, I mean, if you have like some entity like that doing that, it can be a lot more effective than just relying on your own measures.
So we need Siri, some kind of AI to help us with our personal security. Like, hey, don't click that email, or you may want to put that in a different folder, or you sure you want to put that on Dropbox?
Yeah, I was thinking maybe some intelligent bots, AI enabled, that would make you aware that live on your computer will make you aware once you do something stupid.
Absolutely. What else can we do, please?
I guess in talking about AI, well, we kind of reach a point where if the AI is smarter than us, the AI can maybe protect our data so that even hackers won't be able to get in because the AI should be smarter than them and kind of come up with a solution maybe immediately or very quickly to protect our data.
That AI is also vulnerable to hacking and biases and all sorts of issues as well too. Every system can be gamed, right? So if we trust one system, then that will be gamed. Just how hackers chase value. So what other systems can we have? What other institutions do we need? Do we get that there's individual things? What companies should exist? What opportunities are there to improve our individual or collective security? I don't understand why we don't have personal cyber insurance for one. That seems like an obvious thing to me, especially if you take it to the realm of like medical data being stolen. I think that's an obvious slam dunk for an insurance company to do one day. So I want to end with 3 major thoughts on security. Good security is far more than compliance. It's far more than checking a bunch of boxes and meeting a bunch of regulations. It's about being proactive now. Organizations should be designed with security considerations at each and every level. So it's an organizational design problem, just like anything else. And the same could be said about societies and governments too. Societies and governments must be designed with security considerations at each and every level. And then security is the individual's responsibility. Nobody told us this. We never got the memo about this. No one ever said, you're entirely responsible for your cybersecurity, the safety of your messages, your behaviors, your actions, and far more, and data that's made about you. And you're responsible for that, and you have full liability. But that's the situation that we're in today. So now that we know that, perhaps we can start building better individual security, like you all have very correctly said. So I want to end on this note by the late Andy Grove from Intel. It says, only the paranoid survive. So what I'm advocating for here is a sense of strategic paranoia, not to be scared about the world, but instead to be paranoid, understand that there's threats out there, and to be proactive and to deal with this, and to look for opportunities, because there are many, many billion-dollar industries that need to be built here. We have huge problems to solve, and you are all very well positioned to deal with this sort of thing. So we're going to keep coming back to security because security really underpins so many other things as well too.